The car was still rolling when I realized she wasn't breathing. Traffic noise faded. My hands were steady, but everything else went quiet. I remember thinking how strange it was that no one around us noticed. A man in a delivery uniform, a woman everyone recognized. I leaned across the console without thinking. It was instinct, not courage. Later, they would call it something else. When her eyes finally opened, she stared at me like I had crossed a line I didn't know existed. That was the moment I understood this was not about saving a life. It was about what people would say afterward, and who would decide the truth. I used to believe that a quiet life was a kind of protection. If I kept my head down, did my work, and stayed inside the lines, nothing serious could touch me. That belief shaped everything I did. I woke up before dawn, packed my son's lunch, checked his homework, and drove him to school every morning without fail. Then I put on my uniform and became invisible. Driving was steady work. Long hours, predictable routes, no room for mistakes. I worked for a private service contracted by people who valued discretion more than personality. That suited me. I listened more than I spoke. I watched traffic patterns, body language, moods. I learned how power sounds when it thinks no one important is listening. When I was assigned to her family, nothing felt unusual at first. The car was new. The schedule was strict. The pay was better than anything I had known. I signed paperwork that reminded me repeatedly that I was replaceable. I understood that. I had no interest in being anything else. She sat in the back seat, usually on her phone, sometimes staring out the window. We rarely spoke beyond directions. There was a wall between us, reinforced by glass, money, and expectation. I respected it. I needed the job. More than that, I needed stability for my son. Trust for me was practical. You trust systems because you cannot afford not to. At home, life was simple: dinner together, homework at the table, television on low volume while I folded laundry. I never brought work inside. My son knew I drove important people, but that was all. I never named them. Names create weight. Weight invites questions. I did not think of myself as brave or passive. I thought of myself as careful. Careful men survive. I believed that if I followed rules written and unwritten, I would be left alone. The world, I assumed, rewarded restraint. Looking back, that was my mistake, not the belief in work or routine or dignity. The mistake was thinking that trust was mutual, that because I respected boundaries, others would too, that silence was neutral. At the time, everything felt balanced, ordinary, safe enough. I had no reason to think that one moment, one decision made without thought, would redraw every line I depended on. I did not yet understand how quickly stability can turn fragile when power notices you, when silence is interpreted as consent, and when loyalty is mistaken for weakness. That understanding came later, slowly, and without any warning at all in the end, finally. The first shift in the atmosphere was subtle enough that I almost missed it. Not an event, not a conversation. Just a change in how the air felt inside the car. She started speaking more. Small comments at first, asking how long I had been driving, whether I liked the job, if my son enjoyed school. The questions were polite, even considerate, but they unsettled me. Not because they were invasive, but because they crossed a boundary that had been carefully maintained. I answered briefly, always returning my focus to the road. I told myself it was harmless. People with money get bored. Silence makes them restless. Still, I adjusted the rearview mirror slightly so I could see less of her face. I didn't want to read into expressions that were none of my business. Then the schedule began to change. Last-minute requests, longer routes at night, waiting outside places long after business had concluded. Once she didn't come back to the car for over an hour. When she finally did, her hands were shaking. She said nothing. I drove. There was a night when she asked me to stop unexpectedly on a quiet stretch of road. She said she needed air. I stepped out with her, keeping my distance, my eyes scanning the dark like I always did. She stood close enough that I could smell her perfume. I remember thinking it was unnecessary, that nothing good comes from standing still in unfamiliar places. She thanked me afterward, her voice lower than usual. I nodded, professional, neutral. But when we returned to the car, I felt the discomfort settle into my chest. Not fear, awareness. At work, I noticed looks. Not directed at me exactly, more like people checking whether I was paying attention, whether I was noticing something they assumed I wouldn't. I told myself I was imagining it. Stress can make patterns out of nothing. At home, I found myself quieter. My son asked if I was tired. I said yes. It was easier than explaining a feeling I couldn't name. I slept lightly, woke before my alarm. The discomfort wasn't dramatic. It didn't demand action. That was what made it dangerous. It sat quietly beside me like a passenger I hadn't agreed to take, whispering that something was shifting, that the rules I relied on were being rewritten without my consent. I didn't confront it. I didn't question it. I did what I always did. I waited. I trusted that professionalism would protect me, that restraint would be enough. I hadn't yet learned that early warnings don't announce themselves loudly. They arrive politely and they wait to see if you'll ignore them. The first thing that no longer fit was her tone when she spoke to other people in front of me. She had always been composed, distant in the way powerful people often are, but slowly that distance shortened, not with me directly, at least not at first. It showed in how she introduced me. She stopped saying my driver and started using my name. Sometimes she paused before saying it, as if testing how it sounded out loud. At events, people began to look at me longer than necessary. A fraction of a second too long, long enough to suggest curiosity, not recognition. I stayed where I was supposed to be, near the car, near the door, eyes forward. But I felt their attention on me, pressing lightly like fingers on glass. One night while waiting outside a private residence, I received a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. When I mentioned it casually later, she looked up too fast, asked what time it rang, asked if I recognized the number. I said no. She nodded, but the moment lingered longer than it should have. She began sitting in the front seat sometimes, said it helped her think. I adjusted my posture, kept my hands visible on the wheel. The space between us felt smaller, more charged. Silence, which used to be neutral, became heavy. I could feel when she was looking at me without turning my head. The red flags weren't dramatic. No inappropriate words, no direct requests, just pressure building in absence. A kind of expectation that wasn't spoken but felt, like standing in a room where the temperature keeps rising and no one mentions the heat. Then there was the night she was late again, much later than usual. When she finally came out, she looked different, pale, breathing shallow. She got into the car and told me to drive, then stopped me halfway down the street. She said she felt dizzy. Her hand brushed my arm as she steadied herself. It was brief. Accidental, maybe. But she didn't pull away immediately. I remember freezing, not physically but internally. Every instinct told me this moment mattered, that whatever I did next would define something I didn't want defined. I stepped out, opened the back door instead, and gave her space. She watched me, unreadable. At home that night, I replayed the moment again and again, not because I wanted it to mean something, but because I feared it already did. Power doesn't need to declare itself. It waits. It creates situations where silence becomes consent and distance becomes refusal. The red flags were there. Clearer now. I still didn't act. I still believed restraint would keep me safe. I was wrong, but at the time all I knew was that the ground beneath my routine had started to shift, and I could no longer pretend it was solid. After that night, things did not escalate the way people imagine they do. There was no confession, no boundary crossed in public. What changed instead was how often I was told that nothing had changed. She became sharper with me, not openly cruel but precise. Questions that sounded harmless carried weight. Why I had taken a longer route one evening, why I had checked the rearview mirror so often, why I seemed distracted. Each question was calm, almost caring, but stacked together they formed an accusation I could not answer. When I tried to restore distance, she noticed immediately. She commented on it once lightly. Said I had gone formal. Smiled as if it were a joke. I apologized without knowing what I was apologizing for. At work, others followed her lead. Her assistant began copying senior staff on emails meant for me. Schedules changed without notice. Small mistakes, traffic delays, security clearances were documented. Nothing serious, but everything written down. I felt watched, measured, quietly judged. The gaslighting came in fragments. When I mentioned that the environment felt tense, I was told I was tired. When I asked for clarification on a late-night assignment, I was told I was reading too much into it. Once, after a long silence in the car, she asked why I looked uncomfortable. I said I was. She nodded and said, "Good, I'd hate to think you felt anything inappropriate." The word lingered. Inappropriate. I began doubting my own memory. The look she gave me when she sat in the front seat, the pause before she said my name. The way her hand stayed on my arm, each moment isolated could be dismissed. Together they felt deliberate. But every time I tried to hold them together in my mind, her voice intruded, calm, reasonable, corrective. At home, the strain showed. My daughter asked why I was quieter. I told her work was busy. I stopped sleeping deeply. I started rehearsing conversations in my head that I never had out loud. The worst moment came when a senior executive pulled me aside and asked if everything was professional. He did not accuse me of anything specific. He didn't need to. The implication was enough. I said yes. I said always. He looked relieved, not convinced. Later that night, she thanked me for handling things maturely. I didn't know what she meant. I didn't ask. That was when I understood the imbalance fully. She controlled the narrative without ever stating it. I was either silent or suspect. If I defended myself, I confirmed something I couldn't name. If I stayed quiet, I was complicit in my own misrepresentation. Gaslighting doesn't feel like being lied to. It feels like being gently guided away from your own certainty. By then, I was no longer asking whether something was wrong. I was asking whether I was wrong. The truth did not arrive as a single moment. It came in pieces, small and unemotional, like paperwork. It started with a message I wasn't supposed to see. Her assistant forwarded an email chain by mistake. It was brief, no names, no details, just a line that read, "We need to be careful about how this looks. He's noticed the shift." There was no correction afterward, no follow-up apology. The silence that followed felt intentional. I read it several times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't inventing meaning again. This time there was no tone to misinterpret, no expression to soften, just words. After that I paid closer attention, not in a paranoid way, quietly, the way you do when you already know something is wrong but need proof to survive it. I noticed how security logs were being adjusted retroactively, how my access badge worked everywhere except one floor, how conversations stopped when I entered a room, not abruptly, but politely, as if people were being considerate of my presence. That was worse. One evening, an older driver pulled me aside in the garage. He had been with the company for years. He didn't ask questions, he just said, "Be careful, these things don't end cleanly for people like us." He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. The most unsettling confirmation came from a compliance officer I barely knew. She requested a routine check-in. Her tone was neutral. Her questions were structured, too structured. She asked about boundaries, about communications, about anything that could be framed later as mutual. I answered carefully, truthfully. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Document everything." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Even if you think it doesn't matter." That was when I understood the shape of what was happening. This wasn't about an incident. It was about positioning, about who would be believed if something ever needed to be explained away. At home, I started writing things down. Times, locations, exact phrases, not because I wanted to accuse anyone, but because I was afraid of losing the sequence of events, afraid that if I didn't record them, they would dissolve under pressure. I found myself rereading the night of the kiss, not the act itself, but what followed, the silence, the shift, the way everything after it had been rearranged without acknowledgement. I realized then that the danger wasn't scandal, it was erasure. She never mentioned that night again. But her behavior made sense only if she assumed it existed as leverage, something unspoken but understood, something that could be framed however she needed it to be. That realization didn't bring relief, it brought weight, because partial truth is heavier than ignorance. Once you see the outline of betrayal, you carry it alone until the rest decides to surface or crush you first. Once I started documenting, the atmosphere changed again. Not dramatically, more cautiously. As if an invisible line had been drawn and both sides were aware of it, assignments shifted. I was no longer scheduled for private routes. Everything was suddenly policy-based. Shared vehicles, rotating supervisors, formal check-ins. It looked fair on paper. In practice, it isolated me. I was present but never central, useful but replaceable. She became distant in a way that felt strategic. No more personal remarks, no lingering glances. She addressed me the way she addressed vendors, with efficiency and distance. If anyone reviewed our interactions, they would see nothing unusual. That, I realized, was the point. At the same time, pressure increased from elsewhere. HR sent reminders about conduct. Legal circulated updated guidelines about power dynamics, phrased broadly enough to apply to anyone. Meetings were scheduled, then postponed. I began to feel like I was being prepared for something without being told what it was. One afternoon, I was asked to provide a written account of any interactions that could be misconstrued. The phrasing was careful, it didn't accuse me. It invited me to implicate myself. I took the document home and stared at it long after my daughter had gone to sleep. I wrote slowly. I described facts, not feelings, dates, times, locations. I avoided interpretation. I avoided motive. I knew that anything emotional could be reframed as instability. When I submitted it, nothing happened. No acknowledgement, no feedback, just silence. That silence spread. Colleagues stopped asking how I was. A supervisor who used to joke with me kept conversations strictly professional. I overheard my name once in a hallway, followed by a pause. The pause said more than words could. The escalation reached its peak when I was temporarily reassigned pending review. It was presented as a neutral step, standard procedure. No loss of pay, no formal allegation, just removal. I packed my things while someone watched, not closely, just enough to make it clear this wasn't optional. At home, I told my daughter I would be around more for a while. She smiled, unaware of what that meant. I sat at the kitchen table long after she went to bed, listening to the refrigerator hum, thinking about how quickly a life can narrow. The next day, a news alert crossed my phone, a corporate announcement, a philanthropic initiative bearing her name. Photos of her smiling, composed, untouched by anything personal. The contrast felt deliberate. That was when I understood the escalation wasn't about resolving risk, it was about containing it, about making sure that if anything ever surfaced, it would surface on her terms against a background carefully prepared to absorb it. I was no longer part of the story being written. I was an appendix, a liability to be managed quietly. And in that quiet, the cost became clear. Not just to my job. To my sense of reality. To the idea that doing nothing wrong was enough to protect you. The breaking point didn't arrive with shouting or confrontation. It came in a much quieter way, spread across several ordinary moments that no one else would have noticed. I woke up one morning and realized I was checking my phone with dread instead of habit. Not for messages, but for the absence of them. Silence had become a signal. Every hour without an update felt intentional, as if time itself was being used to wear me down. I stopped explaining the situation to myself. That was new. For weeks I had been replaying events, adjusting details, wondering if I had misunderstood something or reacted too cautiously. Now the questions faded. What remained was a simple awareness. Whatever truth existed no longer belonged to me. The system had absorbed it. I noticed it in my body before my thoughts caught up. My shoulders stayed tense even when I was sitting still. Sleep came late and left early. When my daughter asked why I was home so much, I gave neutral answers. I didn't want her to learn uncertainty from me. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I remembered the exact moment everything had shifted, the instant when an act meant to save a life had been reframed as something dangerous, inappropriate, or convenient to erase. The memory no longer hurt sharply. It felt dull, compressed, like something sealed away. That scared me more than anger would have. I realized I had been waiting for acknowledgement, not justice, not apology, just a confirmation that what happened was real, that I hadn't imagined the closeness, the urgency, the shift in tone afterward. But no one was going to offer that. The absence was the answer. The emotional weight settled in when I understood the cost wasn't temporary. This wasn't a misunderstanding that would clear up. It was a permanent adjustment, a quiet correction applied to my life so that hers could remain uninterrupted. I felt small in a way I hadn't before, not insignificant but easily movable, like an object that could be relocated without explanation. I had followed rules. I had stayed restrained. None of it mattered once the narrative needed simplifying. That night I stood in my daughter's doorway longer than usual, watching her sleep. Her breathing was steady, predictable. I focused on it because it was the only thing that felt stable. I thought about what I would tell her one day if she asked why things changed. I knew I wouldn't tell the story the way it had happened. I would tell a version that removed names, power, imbalance. I would protect her from understanding too early how easily truth can be reshaped. The breaking point wasn't despair. It was acceptance. I accepted that nothing more would come. No message, no clarification, no reversal. The silence wasn't temporary, it was structural. And once I accepted that, the struggle stopped. Not because things improved, but because I finally understood the shape of what I was living inside. The consequences didn't arrive the way people expect them to. There were no public acknowledgements, no visible fallout, nothing that would have made a good headline. What happened instead unfolded quietly, behind glass walls and closed calendars. I learned about it indirectly. My route was changed without explanation. The dispatcher avoided eye contact when handing me the update. It wasn't punitive, it was careful. The kind of adjustment made when someone wants distance without confrontation. A week later, a supervisor I had never met before sat in on my review. He spoke politely, used neutral language, praised my reliability. Then he added a sentence that didn't belong. "We appreciate how professionally you handled a sensitive situation." He didn't look at me when he said it. That was when I understood the shape of the consequence. Not mine, hers. The incident had been contained, categorized, archived. The system had done what systems do, it minimized risk. And risk in this case wasn't the act itself, it was proximity, visibility, the possibility that a narrative might drift out of alignment. I noticed that her name stopped appearing in internal updates. The route connected to her residence was reassigned permanently. Not erased, just moved away from me. The separation was surgical. There was no satisfaction in realizing this, just confirmation. People around me didn't treat me differently, but they were gentler. Conversations paused when I entered rooms, not out of suspicion, out of awareness. Something had happened and everyone knew not to ask. The real consequence showed itself weeks later in the smallest way. A letter arrived at my address, No return name, just a single page. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even personal. It thanked me for decisive action under pressure and confirmed that all matters related to the incident were resolved. Resolved meant closed, final, unreachable. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it away, not because it mattered, but because it represented the only official acknowledgement that would ever exist. Her life continued uninterrupted. That was the point. Nothing dramatic had to happen to her for the system to succeed. Stability was the reward. Distance was the correction, and my life, it adjusted around the silence. I worked, I paid bills, I cooked dinners, I stayed present. The consequence for me wasn't loss, it was clarity. I understood now how easily someone could be removed from the story once they'd served their purpose. There was no bitterness left, just a clear understanding of where I stood, and where I never would again. Nothing dramatic marked the end, no moment where everything made sense. Life simply settled into a new, narrower shape. Months passed, the roots stayed the same, the silence held. I stopped expecting anything to surface because I understood now that truth doesn't always rise. Sometimes it's weighed, measured, and deliberately kept low. I became more careful, not fearful, just precise. I learned how little space I was allowed to occupy in other people's stories. I stayed within it. My daughter grew, she laughed more. She stopped asking why I seemed tired. I made sure of that. Whatever had happened belonged to me, not her. Occasionally I thought about that moment, the urgency, the closeness, the choice that couldn't be undone. I no longer questioned it. I knew I would make the same decision again, even knowing the cost. Not because it changed everything, but because it showed me exactly how the world works when power feels threatened and truth becomes inconvenient. And once you understand that, you stop waiting for things to return to how they were. You just keep going.